For years, the farmer kept that dusty airstrip alive, mowing it every Sunday, even as the bank circled like vultures. Locals mocked him, said he was clinging to ghosts. But on a stormy night, a shadow roared through the clouds, a massive C-17 coming in fast. By dawn, the land would never be his again. The wind howled through the darkened skies as Thomas worked under the flickering glow of his tractor's headlights. He didn't mind the cold or the rain that battered him from every angle. He'd been doing this for years. Every Sunday, no matter the weather, he mowed the old airstrip his grandfather had built. The world had long since forgotten its purpose, but Thomas never could. The bank had been on his tail for months, and his neighbors had stopped offering help years ago. They all thought he was foolish, stuck in the past, holding on to a piece of land that wasn't worth a dime. The airstrip wasn't just a patch of grass to him. It was his family's legacy. It was his last connection to a time when things were simpler, when the world made sense. As the blades of his mower cut through the tall grass, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting a losing battle. The farm had been in his family for generations, but now it seemed like nothing more than a dying relic. The offers to sell had been coming in for months, but Thomas refused. He couldn't let it go, not yet. Then, as the storm reached its peak, something in the sky caught his eye. A low rumble, deeper than thunder, sent a chill down his spine. His heart raced as he squinted into the dark sky. A massive shadow loomed, too low, too fast. It wasn't the usual plane that passed by. This was something else. His stomach dropped as the silhouette took shape. A military C-17, coming in too fast, too close. The roar of the engines drowned out the storm, and for a moment Thomas wondered if he was dreaming. The plane was coming straight for him, its massive wings slicing through the thick rain. He stood frozen, unable to move, as the C-17 made an impossible landing, skidding across the old runway, barely missing the trees at the end. The ground shook beneath him. It was like something out of a nightmare. By the time the plane came to a halt, the storm seemed to fade into the background. The silence that followed was deafening. But it didn't last long. A convoy of black SUVs screeched to a halt around the plane. Military personnel in full gear jumped out, their boots thundering against the soaked earth. They stormed his property like a well-oiled machine, moving with a purpose that sent a wave of fear through Thomas. He hadn't seen a soul for days, and now his farm was swarming with people in uniforms, as though the entire world had just turned its eyes on him. Before he could even process what was happening, a tall officer approached, his face unreadable. "This airstrip is now under military control," he said, his voice cold and official. Thomas stood there, mouth dry, unable to speak. He didn't understand. He didn't want to understand. But one thing was clear. By morning, everything he knew would be gone. His farm, his legacy, his last hope. The storm hadn't let up, but the cold was the least of Thomas's concerns now. The black SUVs scattered like ants around the wrecked airstrip, and the soldiers seemed to be everywhere, moving with purpose, pulling out equipment from the plane, their eyes scanning the surroundings. One by one they ignored Thomas, as though he no longer mattered. But the officer who had spoken earlier stood still, watching him. He didn't say anything more, but the weight of his gaze sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. Minutes passed, like hours, and still Thomas couldn't move. His hands trembled, and he wiped them on his soaked jeans. Why had they come here? What was so important about his small piece of land? The thought gnawed at him, keeping him rooted to the spot. He knew something was happening, something that didn't belong on this quiet farm, but the questions piled up faster than answers. What was in that plane? And why him? Why had they chosen his airstrip? As if answering his silent questions, another officer, This one, with a stern face and a walk that screamed authority, marched up to him. "You're the owner of this farm?" he asked, his tone more of a command than a question. Thomas nodded, his throat dry. I'm Thomas." His voice cracked, but he fought to keep it steady. He didn't know why he had to explain himself, but the weight of the officer's gaze felt like a courtroom. The officer stepped closer, his eyes studying Thomas, reading him in a way that made him feel exposed. "Do you realize what you've just witnessed?" he asked. "This wasn't a normal landing, not even close. You've just seen something you weren't supposed to see." Thomas's pulse quickened. "I don't understand." The officer raised a hand, cutting him off. "And you won't, not yet. But understand this," he said, his voice low. "This place? It's more important than you realize, more than any of us are willing to admit." Before Thomas could respond, the officer turned sharply and walked away, leaving a trail of unanswered questions hanging in the air. Thomas stood frozen, the words echoing in his mind. More important than you realize. The rain continued to fall, but now it felt like it was pouring over him, drowning out everything else. The world had shifted on its axis, and Thomas had somehow found himself in the center of it. His grandfather's airstrip, his last connection to the past, was now a battlefield between forces he couldn't comprehend. What was going on? What did they mean by more important than he realized? A low hum interrupted his thoughts, the sound of engines revving. He looked over to see the massive C-17 being slowly unloaded. Soldiers were pulling out crates, each one labeled with codes and numbers Thomas couldn't understand. Every movement felt deliberate, planned. It was as if they had been preparing for this day for years, and he was nothing more than an obstacle. But Thomas wasn't about to let it go. He couldn't. His gaze moved back to the officer, who had now joined a group of men near the plane. They were talking in hushed tones, looking over at him from time to time. Were they talking about him? His heart beat faster. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. He started walking towards them, his boots sinking into the wet earth with every step. But just as he neared the group, a sharp voice stopped him dead in his tracks. "Stay where you are!" A soldier raised a rifle in his direction, eyes cold and unblinking. "You're not authorized to be here." Thomas's breath caught in his chest. The realization hit him like a wave. He wasn't part of this world anymore. He never had been. His little farm, his airstrip, had suddenly become a point of interest for people who didn't care about his story, his struggles, his history. And as the soldier's gaze locked onto his, Thomas knew this wasn't just about the airstrip anymore. This was about something bigger, something dangerous. The officer's words replayed in his mind. "This place is more important than you realize." But what did that mean? The questions kept piling up, each one heavier than the last. His mind raced, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. He had to get closer, find out what was really going on. But before he could take another step, the officer he had spoken to earlier called out from the other side of the plane. "Thomas!" The officer's voice cut through the tension. "You're going to want to see this." Every instinct in Thomas told him to run, to hide, to get as far away as possible from whatever was about to happen. But something inside him, that stubborn pride, his refusal to let go, pushed him forward. And so he followed the officer. What he didn't know was that this simple decision would change everything. Thomas walked cautiously behind the officer, his heart still racing, his mind a whirlpool of confusion. What was he about to see? What could be so important that they needed his attention? As he approached, the officer stepped aside, and the world seemed to fall silent. The crates had been opened, and inside them it wasn't just military equipment. It was documents, piles of them, stacks of paper labeled with numbers and codes, some older than anything he'd ever seen. But the officer's gaze shifted to one box in particular. Thomas followed the direction of his stare and froze. Inside the box, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a large, intricately carved wooden box. It looked almost like a relic, too delicate, too valuable to be left in the hands of strangers. "This," the officer began, his voice filled with a gravity Thomas couldn't ignore, "is what you're really guarding. Not just this airstrip, but what's in it." Thomas stared at the box, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his chest. His grandfather had always talked about history, about preserving the past. He had never mentioned anything like this, though. Could this be what he meant? Was this the reason the airstrip had to stay open? Was this his legacy, not the land, but whatever was inside that box? The officer nodded slowly, as if reading his thoughts. "It's been here longer than anyone realizes. This airstrip, this land, it holds secrets, Thomas. Secrets that could change the world if they fall into the wrong hands." The words struck him like a lightning bolt. "Secrets? What kind of secrets?" Before he could speak, the officer took a step back. "And now it's your responsibility to make sure those secrets don't get out." Thomas felt his legs weaken. His head was spinning. This was more than just an old airstrip. It was a key to something much bigger, something dangerous. But the question remained. Why had they come for him? What made him the right person for this? The officer leaned in, his voice softening. "We need someone who understands the value of this place, someone who won't let it fall apart like everyone else, someone who sees it for what it really is." It hit him then. Thomas wasn't just some stubborn farmer. He was the keeper of something greater, something the world couldn't afford to forget. His refusal to let go of the airstrip wasn't just about pride. It was about protecting the past, ensuring it didn't get lost in the tides of time. The officer's words were still echoing in his ears as he looked out at the vast fields stretching before him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like the last man holding on to a useless dream. The land was more than just a piece of property. It was a lifeline. It was a connection to the past, to something bigger than himself. "I'm not going anywhere," Thomas said, his voice firm. "This is my land, my grandfather's land, and I'll protect it." The officer nodded, a rare look of respect in his eyes. "Then we'll stand with you. Together we can make sure these secrets stay safe." The soldiers began to pack up, their mission far from over. But now, Thomas felt a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for an old piece of land anymore. He was fighting for history, for the truth that needed to stay hidden. He looked at the officer, knowing that their work was only just beginning. As dawn broke over the horizon, Thomas stood tall. His grandfather's legacy had just become his responsibility. The world had changed, but one thing remained the same: the stubborn farmer's resolve. In that moment, everything felt right. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt hope again. If you were moved by Thomas's story, if you felt the weight of his decision and the history he's now carrying, leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts. What do you think will happen next for Thomas and his farm? How do you think the story could improve? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that will keep you at the edge of your seat.